Machiavelli's The Prince, Il Principe, is a masterpiece of political science, of statecraft, of teaching rulers how to rule, how to do their job, a scientific approach, if you will, to organizing society, to politics in its many forms. It is also, arguably, a quite brilliant work of literature. And we'll come back to this, but as literature, it works on multiple levels that have relatively little to do, let's say, with teaching a prince how to be a despot, which is primarily what it is. What it's addressing itself to. It is composed of of 26 relatively short chapters that take on, in a very methodical way, the problems of being a prince, of being a ruler, particularly a ruler in the Renaissance Italy of its day. It is a work written essentially in exile, when Machiavelli suddenly found himself with an awful lot of time on his hands, because after a relatively successful and impressive career in politics as a practitioner of politics and diplomacy and administration, working for a variety of leaders, he found himself on the outs, as tends to happen with politics. Different people come into power and administrations get turnover, and it is not hard to find oneself suddenly out of a job, as he did. He found himself essentially barred from his native city of Florence and stuck on his estate, which I understand is really quite lovely, but it's really not the hubbub of intrigue that he clearly thrives on, a little south of Florence. So he was stuck there, where he writes his famous letter to, he writes the famous letter to his friend Francesco, and embarks on his literary career only pretty much after his political career had come to a crashing halt. He wrote it primarily in 1513, and it existed in manuscript form for him to edit and amend and touch up for really the next 20 years before it was widely published. And it follows in a tradition of a number of great works, known primarily as the Mirror of Princes, where an author will seek to write a book of advice to political leaders, often autocrats of one form or another, and give them advice on how to be an effective and good leader. A number of people that engaged in this thing. You can look in through the history of back to even Plato's Republic is largely a way of how to structure society. Dante very famously wrote De Monarchia, a book of advice for a ruling monarch. Thomas More wrote one at around the same time as he did. That was quite well. He wrote Utopia. He wrote what else? He wrote Erasmus wrote The Education of a Christian Prince around the same time. All of these. This was a fairly well-trodden genre. Yet within that, Machiavelli stands out. Machiavelli takes it upon himself to do stuff that the others just did not do. And in that, he essentially, by rejecting one of the core tenets of the genre, he essentially comes to own the genre. And everybody else seems like a pale imitation of him. That's just my perspective on it. But anyway, we'll get to all of that. The essence of Il Principe is that he is bringing the idea of the advice for a leader into the modern era. He does this as a Renaissance humanist and inaugurates a kind of statecraft, if you will, a kind of theory of political science that is with us to this day in one way or another. The initial chapters, it opens up fairly simply. He has sort of a little dedication, if you will, up front where he explains his project, what he's going to be doing. He talks about how, well, there are different kinds of all the states and governments that ever held or now hold sway over men were and are of two sorts, either republics or principalities. So he's a very direct guy, it would seem, just in that simple declarative and organized methodical statement. And he's going to walk through his argument in a very methodical way. Headings up at the top, walking through his discussion of each topic, and each topic leading from one to the other in a kind of logical but organized and segmented way. Kind of the style that you get in say a Thomas Aquinas, where it is a masterwork of just watching how the man's mind works. That's really more of the fun of the work than actually, sitting there and reading about the princes themselves. That's my opinion of it. He talks a little bit about hereditary principalities and saying that, well, yeah, there are princes who just, they're part of a old and established family who rule over an area, and every generation a new one is designated, and he holds on to that, and it's all kind of boring, and there's nothing to say about that. He doesn't much care. He also references republics and dismisses that as his topic because he says, well, I have dealt with this topic elsewhere, which at the time he first started writing this, he had perhaps, dealt with it in an informal way, but he did collect his writings and organized into discourses on Livy that was came to be published a little bit after The Prince, and that is about republics and free societies, so to speak, and that's significant, and we'll get back to that. But what he's really interested in is so-called mixed principalities, where you have a new prince perhaps taking over or coming into or in some way co-opting an old society, an old princedom, where the relationship between the leader and the people, is perhaps more unnatural or perhaps even violent. This is really his topic. This is what he wants to talk about, and so he writes with some detail on it. In chapter 3, he identifies the problems of so-called mixed principalities, and he gives you a tour of them throughout history. He is writing a very well-researched work, and he draws from, being a Renaissance humanist, he draws from the classical tradition very well, from the Greeks and the Romans, from biblical history, and all the way up through the modern politics of the day. He characterizes these problems very often of problems within the system of a mixed principalities as a medical ailment. This is This is an interesting turn of phrase and a unusual concept, I guess you could say, where he talks about it as there are problems that need to be addressed, as if it were an illness, a disease. And there you can see in just the characterization of that. Again, it's all about the turns of mind that we see here. You can see the concept of science that is so prominent in Renaissance humanism, because it's about objectifying the world around you. It's about applying what the ancients have known to the modern era and testing it. It's about thinking about things independently of the traditions that you have been handed down to. This is all laying the foundation for the Enlightenment, which will come later, but it is a spirit of investigation that is afoot here. And in that scientific cast, you can see him saying, well, okay, let's study the movements and the manipulations of humankind. Let's make a humanistic study of politics. And here you see that scientific impulse taking over and driving a focus on humanity, on simply the way society is organized, that is so characteristic of humanism in general. You know, why would we? Yeah, sure, there's a king, there are people, who cares? That's it. Why bother? Well, no. The idea behind humanism is that it is worthy of consideration. It's worthy of study, so you need to lean into it a little bit. One of the funnier parts of it also is when just again the construction of it, that there are problems in the society and they need they need doctors to attend to it, meaning to take a scientific and a methodical look at the problem and a methodical approach to solving it. But of course, cleverly, he does this in an interesting way. As a writer, he is quite genius, and so he approaches this as this little turn of phrase, this little concept of the doctor approaching a patient with a disease, and he takes that basic metaphor and makes of it a literary and a political statement, because in Italian, the word for doctors, plural, and he uses doctors, is medici. Medici, which is the ruling family of Florence, for whom he has worked in the past, and which he is now on the outs from, and he's trying to ingratiate himself with, so that he can get off of his farm, come back to Florence, and be back in the centers of power where he craves to be. So you can see all of that wrapped up together in Medici, a notion of Renaissance humanism, taking a scientific look at human affairs, the notion of the illness itself being something that can be studied and thus fixed, which is a very can-do Renaissance humanism attitude. It's not something that, just because society has been handed down to you in a certain way, doesn't mean that you cannot remake it in your own vision, which is a very revolutionary concept. But also the simple literary and smarmy touch of saying Medici, the illness in question needs Medici, flattering to the people in power. That's Machiavelli. Chapter 5 gives us a nice little piece of advice that is very characteristic of him when he writes how cities or principalities are to be administered that used to live under their own laws before being conquered. Again, very clear titles to everything. He wrote the titles in Latin. The rest is all in vernacular Italian, which was for him Florentine. So it is very much a Renaissance project that way, importing the classical Latin and celebrating the vernacular Italian. But the advice he gives is there are 3 ways to hold on to people after a military victory over a republic, meaning dealing with a conquered people. How to subdue them. Number 1, he says, destroy them. Raise the earth, kill them all, and just be done with it. Number 2, the leader can go and actually live there, which, presumably a king or a prince has a pretty cushy place back home where he's very comfortable and doesn't want to leave. He just wants new territory to add to his wealth. But going and living there is an option. You can go and live there and be one of the new community and show your commitment to them. Or 3, allow the populace to live under its own laws, but pay high taxes for the right of doing so, while you prop up a local magistrate, an oligarch of some sort, perhaps, to manage it in your absence. He suggests primarily using the 3rd option, because he says a city used to living in freedom can be held more easily with its own citizens. You can promote, let's say, one of them over them as an oligarch, as a leading voice of the community who will now be their guy, but he's your pet all along. But the idea that once somebody is used to freedom, it is hard to shake them of that attachment. So you let them do it. You make them pay, you get the money from them, but that this is the most effective way of holding on to what you have. And just think about the duplicitousness inherent in that statement of, well, yeah, let them think they're free. It is inarguably not half bad advice for a leader to be effective, but it is toying with the whole notion of freedom, because they're really not free. They're living under a foreign tyrant. But he is calculating the actual behavior of people, not what would be the ideal thing to do. The political calculations he makes are often quite striking. And these come out pretty specifically in chapter 6. How you can seize and hold power, which is all wrapped up in the idea of the character of a new prince, which is what he will be returning to quite a lot in the heart of the book a little bit later on. And he says that they have to seize opportunities. They have to hold what he calls, repeatedly, the most often and conspicuously used word of the book, virtue, which in American or in English, virtue is not really the same thing. It has a variety of meanings in the Italian that he is working with. Virtue is coming from Latin, and in a sense it means manliness in one construction, skill, cunning, all of these capabilities and characteristics that are around the ability of one human being to control his environment. And that's what he does. And so he's always strategizing how to do this. He's always coming back to this notion of how do we control people? How do you control people? And he is making a very scientific study of that. He goes through a whole history of great leaders, people who have, as he puts it, seized opportunities, who have had fortune, luck, fall in their lap, but had the skill and the drive to make the most of that opportunity. So here he's got fortune or luck, which just sort of happens to people, and that, he says, is essential, and he'll come back to that, but also virtue, skill, luck and skill. With one without the other, it doesn't really come to much, but with both, and he's clearly leaning on virtue more, or virtue more, with both, you can do just about anything. He recommends that that political leaders in general take a somewhat cunning and strategic approach. He says an interesting calculation here, that a leader should imitate archers with bows and arrows, saying aim higher than the target. So you would aim high, knowing that as the arrow traverses the air, it will start to come down at the end before hitting its target. Aim high, settle for less. And he charts examples of great leaders through classical and contemporary history, mainly classical. He cites Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, all of whom, he says, got nothing from fortune but an opportunity. Interesting. They were able to make the most out of it. Very interesting as well, in that you see Moses, you see classical figures like Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus, great leaders, yeah. No Christ, no Jesus Christ, speaking from the heart of Italy during the Renaissance, which seems an oversight. Is it? Or was it intentional? What are we supposed to draw from this? What are we supposed to assume is his point? Why skip over Christ? It's a very conspicuous omission, and the stunning fact of it just keeps nagging, and it starts to take you out of the work and say, well, gee, you know, there's a little bit of a pattern here, because the morality question is never addressed. Most Mirror of Prince's books are about how to be a good leader. Machiavelli doesn't care. Machiavelli does not address goodness at all. Machiavelli only does how to be a talented or skillful leader, a leader with virtue. You see more examples of this in modern history when he goes through chapter 7, when he talks about new Princetons gained with other men's forces through fortune. And here he's talking about different scenarios where modern strongmen, essentially, have been able to seize and subdue populations. And here he talks quite unashamedly about the skillful use of violence, and how in many respects, conflicts tend to come about, and he seems almost indifferent to the qualities of anyone, but just notes that, okay, in each case, the strongest person won. The one with the most weapons won. If you have arms, if you have weapons, if you have strength, you win. He never addresses whether, they were good or bad. It is quite honestly a might makes right environment here. And he tells this somewhat harrowing tale he tells tales of all of these different people. Alexander the Sixth, who was a pope, Cesare Borgia, who was his father, Francesco Sforza, the leader of Milan, and a long family there. All of these effectual tyrants, and the bloody way that they attained and held on to power throughout their reigns. He makes a nice little scientific study of how to comport yourself, how to hold power. Mantenere lo Stato, as he puts, maintain your state. Stato in the Italian is a little unclear exactly what it means, because it does mean, in the one macro sense, your state, meaning the jurisdictional province under your control, the state. But he also means your status in English. Your state of being, your individual status. So there you have the man and the state conflated as one. Louis XIV saying, "L'état c'est moi." The melding of the personal and the public in a single figure. Very attractive to any strongman in training, obviously. Very enticing to any aspiring political leader who wants to hold power. But a little troubling, again, on that moral front. The idea of identifying your individual person with leadership over a community of other people, and having the power and yourself conflated in a single identity. That is troubling. And he tells probably the most disturbing story about the story of Romero de Ortega, who was installed to, let's just say, briefly, he was installed over to look over a populace. He was essentially one of these autocrats that was installed to maintain the peace, to watch over people who had just been conquered. Well, he did so with a somewhat aggressive hand, and he was known as quite the brutal tyrant, so much so that he got the people to hate him. And then the Duke, who had appointed him, started to realize that, everybody hates him. And that's good because it's breaking their spirit, but it doesn't really do anything for me, because he's just making, I'm hearing all these complaints, and he's making it kind of an ugly place to be. So he did what any good leader or prince or duke would do, and he took Romero de Ortega and killed him, and had him cut into pieces. A little unsure in the Italian exactly how many pieces or whatever, but there were 2 pieces at least, and had them displayed in the town square. Loading 2 people in the public square with a block of wood and a bloody sword near him. The ferocity of this spectacle left these people at the same time gratified and awestruck. So the Duke killed his henchmen looking over this population, because the henchmen had become so hated. So by doing so, the Duke ingratiated himself to the people. They were grateful to him. They were gratified. But at the same time, they saw the ferocity of the dismemberment and we're terrified as well. Fear and gratitude. He's going to come back to this. But in this, you can see how this story, this anecdote, is described with complete indifference to the morality of it, and just saying, well, yeah, chopping that guy up and leaving his remains for everybody to see, that was the right thing to do. That was a smart move politically, because it got rid of the problem. The populace had already been kind of subdued already by the other guy's measures. Now we just get rid of him, because he's the bad guy now, and I come in and I'm the good guy for doing so. Plus, they're going to be simultaneously grateful and terrified. What's better than that? That sense of slippable morality is Machiavelli. That sense of any absence of Christian benevolence is essential. And you can ask yourself, from a literary perspective, is that really horrifying? Are you horrifying? Are you horrified? Do you lean back at that point and say, whoa, what is going on here? That's just horrible. Maybe Machiavelli is making that point. He's writing this text for princes, for autocrats, for the Medici, who were a rough and tumble kind of people, about how to be a good dictator, essentially. But was he really writing it so over the top from time to time? Was he really pushing so far beyond any human morality? Was he really becoming a parody of what a tyrant might actually think? Was he doing this ironically, or was he completely sincere? That is the great jump ball of Machiavellianism. He was a fan of republics in some of his other writings, and scholars will tell you that, well, yeah, he seemed to like republics and freedom and all of that stuff as well. But his actual position is always a little bit difficult to discern, because he was writing these studies, he was writing these analyses, and his actual, endorsements are hard to really tease out of that. But within this one work, within Il Principe, is he actually telling princes to be bad, or is he telling a general readership how to recognize that a prince is bad? And when you start flipping that question around, then you get into the heart of Machiavelli.